Welcome to Know This Live. I'm Zincle Asamoah. Today, I'm joined by Senator Tammy Duckworth. She is an Iraq War veteran who continued serving her country while representing the state of Illinois in the House and now as a senator. She has also been a strong voice calling for more representation, especially for Asian Americans. She joins me now. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be on. Thank you.
Of course, and jumping right in, I know you've been pressuring the White House to come out stronger to elevate Asian American voices at the federal level, especially after the uptick in anti-AAPI sentiments and hate crimes that we've been seeing in the past year. And on Wednesday, President Biden appointed your former general counsel as a senior liaison for Asian Americans. What do you make of that appointment?
I'm very pleased that Erica Morisugu has been appointed. She is brilliant, and she will do what needs to be done in terms of advising the president on AAPI issues. So I think it was a very smart move on the White House part to do that.
And how have you felt? How have you been coping with this uptick in violence against your community?
Well, I think I have the same feelings as many of the within the API community, frustration and fear. But I also feel a sense of responsibility because I am in a position to try to help make things better. My own mother, who's 80 years old, has received comments when she goes grocery shopping. And in fact, in 2020, when the uptick in anti-Asian violence occurred, two-thirds of those crimes were against Asian women, and particularly elderly Asian women, because of the perception that they are easier victims, that they are more compliant and weaker. And so to have my 80-year-old mom out there, going to the stores and stuff really does worry me. But that's on a personal level. For my position in the Senate, I know that there is much that can be done. One of the biggest things that we can do is to gather the data. We know that anti-Asian hate crimes are significantly underreported and often are reported as just simple criminal activities like a mugging or a vandalism or a robbery, when in fact the choice of victims of an Asian American was based on race, and so it is a hate crime.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about what your mom has experienced, but it's clear this is something you've been pushing to address. I know, speaking of the Senate, that 6 male Republican senators voted against advancing a bipartisan legislation that aims to combat hate crimes against Asian Americans. What's your message to those colleagues of yours?
I hope that they will reconsider. I'm happy to chat with them why it's important for us as a nation to pass this legislation. I can't really understand how anyone could vote against legislation that condemns violence against any group of Americans. But then again, not a single Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan either. And it's hard for me to believe, to understand how someone could vote against sending money to our schools so that our kids can go back to in-person education. I don't understand how someone can vote against sending money to struggling families who are just falling behind every single day during this economic crisis that we are in, or vote against providing funds for vaccinations so that we can end this pandemic and then get back to normal. So I'm happy to talk to them, convince them otherwise, but unfortunately, it's not that surprising since not a single Republican voted to help the American people by voting for the American Rescue Plan.
And as you referenced that plan, the rescue plan, there's no shortage of news these days. And I know this week President Biden announced a timeline for withdrawing all troops from Afghanistan. You are an Army veteran, a lieutenant colonel who received a Purple Heart when you served in Iraq. Is this the right move to leave the country?
Well, I wasn't in on those top secret briefings in the White House to know the pros and the cons. I will tell you that we have long past the authorization for use of military force that Congress voted on for action in Afghanistan. We have stayed well beyond what the parameters that were set post 9/11. My position here from the Senate is if we're going to stay there any longer, we need to end the existing authorization for use of military force, which were voted on 20 years ago, and instead have a new debate and have a new vote on the parameters for whether or not we do want the troops to stay. But absent that, the troops do need to come home, because I do think that the American people want the troops home. And now we have to decide what are we going to do and how are we going to address and safeguard our national security issues when it comes to the Taliban.
And what do you say to critics who say this will create a breeding ground for terrorism in Afghanistan, particularly for women, and open up more human rights from the Taliban? Human rights abuses, excuse me.
Right. Well, what I say is then tell your members of Congress to have the debate on the floor of this House and in the Senate. And if you think that we need to have our troops back in Afghanistan, then let's have that discussion here and let's have another vote and say, okay, we want to vote to send American troops to Afghanistan to safeguard the human rights of Afghani women. Then let's have that vote. But the authorization for use of military force that our troops are operating under had to do with the 9/11 attacks back in 2001. And so I am open to having that discussion. I am open to then making up my mind and voting either way. But to keep our troops there under an AUMF that is 20 years old, older than many of the troops who are being sent there now. I mean, we passed that AUMF before some of these troops were born, is a real disservice to our military men and women because they are operating under parameters that no longer exist. And Congress needs to step up and we need to do our job. So all of those critics out there of the president's decision, I tell them, then tell your members of Congress to have this discussion on the floor of the House, on the floor of the Senate, and let's have that vote.
And let's transition now to conflict on our own soil. There have been a lot of disturbing incidents between police and Black people. Just in the last few weeks, we saw obviously the fatal incident with Dante Wright and a disturbing scene with Lieutenant Nazario from Virginia, who was pepper sprayed. You are requesting a civil rights investigation into that incident. What do you want to see done?
Well, I want to see exactly whether his civil rights were violated. I want to know more about the circumstances of what happened there. As someone who served in the military for 23 years, next to my left and to my right with, in particular, Black officers who were my peers and many of whom were my superior officers, I know that oftentimes they were targeted because of their race. And I just want to make sure that especially as people who are wearing the uniform of this great nation, protecting the civil rights of other Americans, that they do not have their civil rights compromised either. So I want to get to the bottom of what happened there, and I want to make sure that if there was a civil rights violation, that then we pursue the appropriate remedies against that.
And I want to turn also on another front to Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. He made a lot of headlines last year for plans to raise postage prices, extend delivery windows, and reduce post office hours. You have been very vocal in leading the charge to ask the Biden administration to respond to your calls for firing. What have you heard from them?
Well, he needs to be fired. He was put there by President Trump and commercial interests to destroy the United States Postal Service. And he's done a pretty good job of really wounding our postal system. And that is to the detriment of the American people. It's not just about Christmas cards that show up 3 months late, which, by the way, happened to me. But it's about veterans who get their medications through the mail. It's about senior citizens who rely on getting their checks and getting their medication, whether or not they're veterans, through the mail. This man is incompetent. I wish it was just incompetence, but he, in fact, has been very good at systematically dismantling the U.S. Postal Service, and he needs to be fired. Now, the problem that we have right now is that the President of the United States can't fire the Postmaster General. The Board of Governors has to do it. The President can appoint the Board of Governors, and he's appointed, nominated several already, but we need to make sure that those Board of Governors who support Mr. DeJoy, they need to lose their jobs as well and be replaced with people who actually want to serve the American people by repairing and bringing the U.S. Postal Service back to where it used to be, where you could really rely on the mail. It would get there on time in an affordable way that most Americans can actually afford to use the Postal Service, and that it is a crown jewel in our country, that something that Ben Franklin started that worked for hundreds of years, Mr. DeJoy very successfully wounded and crippled in just a few short years of being on the job.
And it's clear even in our conversation that there is a lot you're advocating for and a lot you're pushing for. And I know that you also just wrote a memoir, Every Day is a Gift. And I noticed a thread of just overcoming adversity, right? You talked about your childhood. or your injuries in Iraq when a helicopter was hit by a rocket grenade, yours. And the book really just highlights your resilience. And I know that this has been a difficult year for a lot of Americans. So what's your message to them based on the many lessons you've learned from these experiences?
Well, it's the title of the book is the lesson that I hope people get, that every day is a gift, that despite losing my legs, I am grateful that I'm alive today. I wrote the book because my daughter, my 6-year-old, one night she asked me, why couldn't someone else, mommy or daddy, gone to war and lose their legs? Why did it have to be you? And in trying to answer that question, I wanted to tell her stories about why America is worth it, why this nation that I love so much was worth the sacrifice. And yes, it's a story about my personal struggles, but it's really about the fact that every time I needed help, I got it. When I was hungry as a teenager, it was food stamps that put food on my table. When my family could no longer afford tuition for a private school overseas, it was a public school system and a public school teacher who paid out of his own pocket and bought me dinner 2 or 3 nights out of the week because he knew that me and the other food stamp kids were not going to get to eat that night. So it's really a celebration and a love letter to my country of how America and the social systems that are in place is really worth it. Because this country, if you don't give up on yourself, this country won't give up on you. And that's the message I hope my book sends. And it's really an explanation to my daughter why America every day is worth it and every day is a gift. And I hope that someday, and I end it with a letter to my daughters, telling them that, this is a great nation and I hope someday you choose to serve this nation as well.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on and a beautiful one. So Senator Duckworth, thank you so much for your time and for your service.
Thank you.